Hey, church family. It is April 29th, Wednesday morning. Been thinking this week about prayer, obviously, because we've been talking about that on Sundays, but I've also been thinking about wisdom and how we need wisdom, and I want to talk about that today, both prayer, wisdom, learning. And in a week and a half from now, I'm preaching. I'm doing these prayers, and in a week and a half from now, I'm doing this prayer of Solomon, the great prayer of Solomon, King Solomon, for wisdom. And so I've been spending time on him and his life, and I was reading the little story that gives us an example of his wisdom, and it's in 1 Kings 3, and it's 16 through 33. It's a little story kind of showing us an example. It's an example of how wise he was, this King Solomon. And maybe you're familiar with the story. It's a crazy story. It's a story that really shows how truth can be extracted. And so if you're not familiar with it, go back and read it. But it's basically this. There's two women that have just had children. So they're living together. These two women are living together alone. They have two newborn babies, and something tragic happens. In the middle of the night, one of the mothers who's sleeping with the child accidentally rolls over onto the child and smothers the child. And so in her grief, in the middle of the night, she acts quickly. She runs to the other mother's room, and she swaps the children. She swaps the deceased child with the living child, essentially kidnapping. The other mother, when the morning comes to, realizes it's not her child. What should we do about this? Horrible situation. So she takes her to court, which is where she brings, and this situation brings this case before the king, Solomon. Now, this is a difficult, basically seemingly impossible situation to solve because there are no witnesses. The author lets us know that. So how do we get to the truth? How do we get to the bottom of it? And we see Solomon do something so wildly just wise and smart and intuitive. So he bluffs. He says, okay, here's how we'll get to the bottom of this. Give me a sword, and I'll take this sword, and I'm going to divide the child into this living child, into this living baby, and give you each half. And this is where it gets really interesting. I know this is kind of tragic and strange and dark, but it's so interesting. So after Solomon says this is what he's going to do, he's just going to cut the child in half and be really fair and just give you two halves of this baby. Verse 26, the real mother of the living child looks at this potential impending huge loss of for her child, and she says this in verse 26 of the king. She says, quote, "Oh, my lord, give her the living child." So give my child to this other mother. Give her the living child, and by no means put him to death. And the mother, who's lying in her grief, right? She says this, quote, "He shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him." And then the king answered and said, "Give the living child to the first woman, and by no means put him to death. She is his mother." I've been sitting with this all week. In one sense, it's like a crazy story, but this is the phrase, this idea, this poor woman, this poor mother's grief, the mother who had, accidentally smothered her child and experienced the loss of her child. She is saying to this other living child, "He shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him." Nobody gets this child. No one should have this child. Like, I've been struck all week by the rage and the anger and the hatred. In one sense, it's like in one sense, how can you not feel a sense of compassion for the poor woman? Like, she suffered tragedy, and it's clear when you look into it and you think about it, just ponder it for a moment. These are human beings. Like, she just isn't processing it. Right? She's not taking the time to grieve. She doesn't know what to do. So in one sense, you have compassion. And in another sense, like you can stand back from it and you can go, oh, but like this is not the answer, to kidnap, to steal. And at the end, in this scene in the court, to go to the point of saying, sure, like let's just let everybody, like it just turns into this, what I would say, it's like this, just kind of this dumpster fire of anger and rage. And it's just foolishness, really, is what it is. It's like the grief has so unfortunately brought about like a foolishness in her. And you see that Solomon in his wisdom is able to extract that from them. And I've been thinking about what we learn in this, and here's just a few things. Some things I've been thinking about and want to pass along to you. First is this, that grief and hardship have a way of tempting us into foolish anger. I think grief and hardship, tragedy, loss, uncertainty, when we have anxiety that is prolonged and it feels kind of like a never-ending grind of anxiety, I think it has a way of tempting us into blaming and hatred. And I think you see it going on right now during this time of unprecedented pandemic. I think you see it on a national scale. There's a nationalistic rage happening, and a nationalistic racism. There's a cultural racism happening. If you're paying attention, probably maybe more felt and more prevalent in your life right now. There's a neighborly rage happening. You're thinking and feeling and saying things of your neighbors, maybe your literal neighbors living next door to you, that you would never, you think to yourself, I cannot believe how annoyed I am or frustrated with this particular, it's just bringing things out in you. There's a spousal rage potentially happening, and anger, a foolishness of words that are being slung about in our homes. There's rage with our kids. I certainly have felt some of that. There's just all sorts of ways that this time of tragedy and grief is tempting us into pointing our fingers and blaming. We turn so quickly, pain turns so quickly to hate, is kind of my point. And you see that in this poor mother. Also, too, there's another truth here, and that is this, that real truth, real wisdom, real love, when it's on display, when it's coming out in us, it will suffer personal loss for the good of others. You see that, right? You see that in the real mother in the scene, the mother of the living child. The mother does what real mothers do. She takes the hit so the child doesn't have to. Right? She suffers a personal loss in going potentially without her child, and says, no, she can have it because it's more important for me, right? For him, for my son to live. It's more important for my son or my daughter to live than for me to be happy. That's what I want. That's what we should do here. And of course, that also gets her real child back. And so the real mother, if you think and ponder it for a moment, you see the gospel, hopefully the parallels, right? The real mother in the scene does what the real Jesus does for us. Except Jesus does so much more, right? He looks at an unsolvable situation, an unsolvable tragedy of our sin, and he suffers personal loss, except for he actually gets torn apart, right, for our life, so that we can live, so that we can have a life of flourishing. That's why he is the real truthful God among other gods, because he doesn't turn into rage. He doesn't destroy and tear others in the midst of tragedy. He takes it upon himself. He doesn't turn to hatred and blaming, right? He just absorbs. He takes the hit. And I've been thinking in my own life and in the lives of you who are listening about this gospel, this gospel that Jesus gives, makes happen, promises, preaches to us, wants to get sunk into our hearts, and how this gospel of Jesus, what he does, this saving act he does not promise us life without tragedy or loss. What it does, this gospel does, is it promises us a life that when tragedy hits, if we want to, and that's an important nuance that I'm learning, if you want to learn, to develop, to be like him, he's offering us a gospel, a life in the gospel that doesn't somehow go void of tragedy, but it goes away through tragedy of not tearing at other people. Of when grief hits us hard, we don't start, we turn from the temptation to hate. The temptation of hatred, of blaming, of tearing, of destroying others when we grieve and when we suffer loss. It's profound and beautiful. And so there have been noticing that, and I would ask this, what is being revealed in you during the season? We've been talking about listening. We've been talking about how listening hopefully leads to speaking, praying to God. I want to ask you this Wednesday to be curious to hear from you too. Shoot me an email. Like, what is being revealed like there during this time of pandemics? You know, so there's two things that are abundantly true of me, and the Bible speaks to this. Two ways that really extract truth from our lives, that shine a light on true colors. It's this. Two things that always reveal treasure and tragedy is how I'd put it. When you hit a season, when your life hits a season of real treasure, truth comes out. And when your life hits a season of real tragedy, truth comes out. So both, like, you come into riches or you come into loss. They both have a way of kind of pulling out what you really want, revealing what you really are after, what your desires are. And this time is doing that, I think. And what I mean by that is, for some of you, this is an obvious tragedy. Like, you're afraid. Maybe you're experiencing economic loss, and it's pulling from you, tempting you to things. And it's probably showing, if you're listening and looking, you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know this was here in me. For some of you, you haven't suffered loss. This is an extended snow day, and you're soaking up some treasures. So maybe you're not having a windfall of finances, but you are getting the treasure of time at home and with families. And what we do when we're in the abundance of those treasures reveals a lot about us. So what is it revealing about you? The things that you really want, the things that you really have, the things that your life is kind of shaped around. These are wonderful questions I would encourage us all to ask, that both treasure and tragedy is, if you notice, they're dashboards for truth and what we live for. Solomon extracted the truth from these mothers, and pandemic, I think, is extracting the truth in all of us. May we turn to this gospel and not just let it soften us for confession of sin as we learn things about ourselves, but also strengthen us in our ability to love in a deeper way, to love the way Christ loves us. Peace be with you. I hope to hear from you soon.